Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this episode is all about a legendary figure in the sport of boxing. This figure is Teddy Atlas, a man who has been involved with some notable fighters, including Mike Tyson, Timothy Bradley, and many more. He is also known for being a man motivator, a character, a hothead, and many other things, but he is certainly a legendary figure in the sport that deserves a career profile. And I'm looking forward to delivering this career profile to yourselves. And because of how much of a storied history Teddy has, this is going to be more than one episode. So sit back and enjoy the great stories around Teddy's life, the harrowing moments in Teddy's life, the successes, the triumphs, the tribulations, the ups, the downs. It is one hell of a story, and I really hope you guys enjoy this particular episode. Now, as always, we start at the very beginning, when Theodore A. Atlas Jr., better known today as Teddy Atlas, was born on the 29th of July, 1956, in New York City, to Theodore, a prominent doctor, and Mary, a former Miss Staten Island beauty queen. Dr. Theodore Atlas Sr. was legendary around Staten Island. A Hungarian Jew, originally from the Bronx, he wore a bow tie and a rumpled old raincoat, and he drove an old wreck of a car en route to his house calls, visiting stricken patients. He would travel all over the island, taking care of people, no matter what time of the day or night. If his patients couldn't afford to pay, he didn't charge them, and when he did charge them, the most it would be around $5. Food would also be gifted in exchange for the miracle of good health. In the 1970s, Mary began to call him Columbo, after the character in the famous TV detective show, because of his similar dress style, and because he always seemed distracted and preoccupied with some case or another. Alongside working at his medical practice, Theodore somehow found the time to build 2 hospitals, Sunnyside and Doctors. He would also build over 100 houses on Staten Island, including the 2 properties that housed the 7-strong Atlas clan, a small one-family home and later a large colonial structure that he built across the street, plus some Winn-Dixie's, which is a southern western supermarket chain for those who didn't know, as well as some condos down south. Teddy showed immense pride for his father's altruistic nature by saying, "Think of it, here was a doctor who owned a crane and a bulldozer, and on Sundays, to relax after spending 80 hours a week practicing medicine and taking care of people, he bulldozed the empty lots on the hill where we lived so he could build houses. He even built the sewer system for the whole neighbourhood." Owing to Theodore's manic schedule, Mary, along with Teddy's 4 younger siblings, Tommy, Mary, Todd and Terrell, often felt a lack of attention from their husband and father, if not consciously, at least in our hearts. Teddy would comment that even today he is still approached by people who were patients of his father, beneficiaries of his time and passion for helping others. At home, it was a different story, with Teddy recalling, "It was hard for him to show anything. He considered emotions as a sign of weakness. I remember one time we were in the car, and he made fun of us kids for crying over something. He started going, 'Wah!' in this loud, mocking way. After that, I never cried again, even many years later at his funeral." Of all the children, Teddy appeared to be Senior's favourite, causing there to be a spiritual divide in the household. There appeared to be 2 teams of Atlas's offspring. One team contained Terrell, Todd and Mary. The other comprised of Teddy Sr. and Jr. Teddy idolised his father and shared many of his interests, particularly science, drawing father and son closer. Theodore would take the young Teddy on medical house calls with him, persuaded by his son as a means of Teddy getting to spend more time with his seldom home dad. Teddy would speak fondly of some of the special memories these times would implant in his mind by saying, Occasionally, he would get a call in the middle of the night and I would hear the phone and wake up. By the time he was coming out of his room and down the stairs, I was sitting there ready to go. He would tell me to go back to my room, but sometimes he would give in and let me go with him. I remember going with him on New Year's Eve once, around 1964 or 65, for a maternity case. I must have fallen asleep in the doctor's waiting room. At midnight, one of the nurses woke me up. They were all pouring soda and champagne, saying, "Your father just delivered the first baby of the new year." Half asleep, I joined the celebration, knowing that it was a special thing to be there, even if my father's full attention wasn't focused on me. Teddy's mother, Mary, suffered from Teddy Sr.'s lack of interest in family life more than anyone else. She was Irish and very beautiful, shown by the previously mentioned Miss Staten Island competition win in 1940. Part of the prize that went along with that title was a screen test in Hollywood. But Teddy's grandmother, Helen Riley, had refused to let her go. "That's for tramps," she said. Mary Atlas was the opposite of Theodore. She was very social, talkative, outgoing, used to getting attention, and with a soft spot for material possessions. Meanwhile, Theodore would spend his evenings driving around in run-down vehicles and wearing hole-ridden shoes. Teddy's brother Todd would unfortunately die at the age of 5, causing further division within the Atlas brood. In the words of Teddy Atlas, he said, "Todd had been born retarded and with an enlarged heart, and my father, who read all the medical journals and was always up on all the latest procedures, felt that open heart surgery, which was relatively new at the time, could help him. It was the kind of thing that, where if nothing was done, Todd would die by the time he was 16. So my father made the decision that he should have the operation, and he was there in the operating room watching when Todd died on the table. Years later, a woman named Sally Cusack told me that her daughter's baby had gotten sick later that same day, and my father had gone over to their house and treated the baby. When Sally Cusack found out that her daughter had called my father, she was upset. She said, "You called Dr. Atlas? Didn't you know his son died today?" Her daughter was devastated. "I didn't know," she said. "He came and he never said a thing." That was my father to a T. He never said a thing. Whilst Theodore remained stoic, Mary Atlas exhibited a devastation over Todd's death that made Teddy believe she had suffered a breakdown. Because of this, the remaining Atlas children were sent to live with relatives, whilst Mary struggled to cope with an alcohol problem triggered by her bereavement and a difficult marriage to Theodore. By the time Teddy entered his late teenage years, he was starting to get into trouble regularly, fighting and taking out the resentment born from his challenging home life on his peers at Curtis Public High School. Teddy was a decent student who played on the football team, but he got into fights. He was an angry kid with a rage inside him that he didn't understand. Teddy started hanging out with the kids down the hill in Stapleton, a rough part of town situated on Staten Island. There were housing projects down there, a needle park where all the drug dealers hung out, and plenty of ways for trouble to find Teddy. He would later acknowledge that his insertion into the darker side of society was simply another way to garner the attention of his dad in a more aggressive way than just attending house calls with him. Halfway through Teddy's senior year in high school in 1974 or 75, the rebellious streak intensified and he stopped going to school. "I dropped out," he said. "I was hanging around with the Sullivan brothers down in Stapleton. I'd met Jeannie Sullivan first. He was about my age, with the Irish gift of the gab, and funny, always making people laugh. One time, he and I stole these little manila envelopes from a stationery store and filled them with oregano and stood on the corner selling them as nickel bags of marijuana. We were so stupid. We stayed on the same block for hours until eventually some of the guys we sold them to came back. I mean, we were standing there 3 hours later in the exact same spot, and this car full of Puerto Rican guys drove up, and the driver threw the manila envelope in Jeannie's face. 'Who you guys think you're fucking with?' Jeannie, who knew I was there backing him up, and by then I'd already developed something of a reputation as a street fighter, smiled and said, "What's the matter? It wasn't any good? Don't you know you have to put it on the sausage before you cook it?" These guys went crazy. One of them got out of the car and came at me. I wound up decking him. We were just lucky they didn't have guns. Later on, Teddy would eventually join with Jeannie's brothers, and there were 5 of them all together, and they represented a new family dynamic for Teddy, whose own family were growing further apart emotionally. Over time, Teddy grew close to Billy Sullivan, who was about 8 years older than him, 25 or 26 at the time. Billy was a skinny guy and a sharp dresser, very charismatic and likeable. He knew his way around the street life, teaching Teddy the unorthodox way of life and imparting an education on stuff like craps and blackjack. Teddy said he had all the odds down, knew all the numbers, and I was impressed by that. We'd play craps with guys in the street. Billy was also a very good pool player. I was pretty good, but he was very good, and we'd go into bars and hustle money that way. There were other things that drew me to him. He had a good singing voice, and I loved to hear him sing under the boardwalk. We'd be in a bar, and I'd play it on the jukebox and get him to sing along with it. I'd say, "Sing, Billy," and he would. He got a kick out of the fact that I liked his singing. If anyone in the bar didn't appreciate it as much as I did, I'd tell them, "You better start clapping or smiling, or else get the fuck out." I looked up to Billy. When I think about it now, I can see he was giving me something I wasn't getting at home, a kind of interest and attention that I was starved for. He wasn't just a criminal either. There was this other side to him. He coached a little league team in Stapleton, and he asked me to come down and watch. So I went one day, and there he was standing in the third base coaching box, wearing a uniform, talking to the kids. When he saw me, he winked. I'll never forget that. It had an effect on me, seeing him in that setting, watching him with those kids. Of course, he had to play the tough guy too, so he said to me, "I wish there was a line on his fucking game." Teddy's parents knew he dropped out of school by this point, and they were aware of his sojourn down the crooked path of life. With things still in a tense situation at home, Teddy would fall from grace in a big way, with his coveted relationship with Billy Sullivan being the catalyst for his troubles. While Teddy was staying in Jersey with Billy and his family, the two men broke into a store in the middle of the night and robbed it. Billy always had some nefarious scheme or plan. "All we have to do is break through this cinder block wall and we'll be in the back room of the store where they keep the night's receipts." This is what Billy said, trying to make it sound easy. The reality was quite different, as Teddy and Billy stood in a dingy back alley with an assortment of tools, including screwdrivers, crowbars, trying to hack and chisel their way through the external wall. It took hours. When they finally crawled through the small hole they'd made, they'd found themselves in the wrong place. It was a grocery store, not the hub of riches and exquisite dreams that they'd expected. They robbed it anyway, taking food and fizzy drinks along with a small amount of cash. Teddy would recall the aftermath, spotting the comedy in a mainly unfunny situation. He said, "The really funny part is that the cops actually tracked us down the next day and questioned us about it. They didn't think we did it, but they thought we might know something. They said, whoever did it, they were professionals because they bypassed the wires in the wall without setting off the alarm. That's why we know it couldn't be fucking you idiots." When they left, I said to Billy, "There were wires in the wall? You didn't tell me there were wires in the wall." He was dying laughing. That cop was looking right at your swollen hand saying no way we could possibly have done it. And we're the fucking idiots. On another fateful night, Billy acquired a gun and decided to rob a bar on Bay Street in Stapleton. The would-be thieves were there for a while, drinking and playing pool in the back room, trying to formulate a plan. "Should we rob this fucking joint or what?" Billy snapped. "It's still early. Let 'em get a little more cash in the till. Let's make it worth our while." While they sat in conference, they were joined by a local hoodlum, Robert Holder. Holder, who was known to be a local rat responsible for the arrest of many a wise guy, picked up a pool cue and joined in the discussion. Despite this fact, Billy freely told Robert of he and Teddy's intentions, revealing that he had a gun and was not afraid to use it. Teddy was far from pleased. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted when Robert left briefly. It's okay," Billy said. "Don't worry about it. Come on, I'll buy you another drink." 20 minutes later, and with the action having not commenced, the cops came in, and Teddy recalled, "We were in the back room, they were in the front, but we could see them checking people out, looking around, moving in our direction." "That motherfucker," Billy said. "He gave us up." "You sound surprised." "Shit, the gun. Give it to me. They're going to nail us, Teddy. Give me the gun." In that moment, Billy looked very weak to me. Just a scared kid. I reached into his waistband and took the gun. I could see he wasn't going to be able to handle jail. "What are you doing?" he said. But he didn't try to stop me. When the cops came into the back room, they frisked me and found the gun. They wound up running us both in and taking pictures, fingerprints, the whole bit. My bail was set at $5,000 for the gun charge, but they let Billy out on his own recognizance. Following Teddy's first considerable brush with the law, his father would bail him out the next day. With Teddy's appetite for crime now whetted, he was back in Stapleton just 2 days later, fishing for more chaos. He hooked up with another friend, a guy named John, who had been a football player and was a big, tough bastard intent on inconveniencing the world. John had been stabbed at a New Year's party and lost a kidney, and his was remaining. One felt the strain, as John would regularly inebriate himself until he could no longer stand. The plan for the night was for us to earn, and not in an honest way. They began the evening in Techie's Bar on Gordon Street, across the street from the New York projects. Techie's was a regular haunt, just a small neighbourhood drinking bar housing a shuffleboard machine and a pool table. Another friend of Teddy's, a man by the name of Nipple, who always carried a gun, was also frequenting the bar. Teddy was forthright in ordering Nipple to surrender his gun to Teddy. "What are you going to do?" Nipple asked nervously. There was no question. The idea of giving Teddy his gun made him nervous. "I made a lot of people nervous at that point in my life," Teddy said. "They knew whatever I did, I would really do. I was dangerous. I wasn't a bad kid, but I was dangerous because I was righteous about what I was doing. I thought what I was doing had purpose to it, though I doubt I could have said what it was then, or at least I'd have been wrong." "Come on, give me the gun," Teddy would insist. I don't know. Just give me the goddamn gun." John had this car, a brown Plymouth Roadrunner, that he had wrecked 7 or 8 times, and which he was always hauling into the repair shop. After Teddy retrieved the weapon from Nipple, he went outside and climbed into John's car. A crowd of people followed John and Teddy outside. It was clear they were embarking on a sinister journey. Teddy rolled down the window, and he shot the gun into the air. Later, Nipple told Teddy that as they drove away, he remarked to the gathering, "Well, they're not coming back." For a while, the wannabe robbers just drove around. They stopped on Richmond Terrace, where Teddy Sr. grew up. There was a bar down there. It was closed due to the early morning hour. "You want to go in?" Teddy asked John. "Yeah, let's go in," he agreed. There was a window, shaped like a triangle. Teddy pulled his sleeve over his hand and punched it in, then crawled through the opening, cutting his chest on one of the jagged edges of broken glass. Of the night, Teddy said, "We were terrible criminals. I mean, total amateurs. John was too big to get through the window, so he stayed outside while I poked around in the dark. You find the cash register? Is there any money in there?" "Yeah, they left a box full of fucking money." "At least get us a bottle of scotch." I grabbed a bottle of Johnny Walker and crawled back out. John guzzled a quarter of the bottle right there on the curb, then got back behind the wheel of the Roadrunner. We drove around a while more, finally stopping at Hess gas station. The gas station provided the setting for even greater trouble. Teddy relays this scene in his autobiography, From the Streets to the Ring. He said, In those days, they had the cement capsules for the attendants to put the money in. These concrete tubes right on the fuel island next to the pumps. It was a security thing. They put the money in there, and that way they wouldn't get robbed. But this was a weekend night. They'd been busy, and the capsule was so full of money that it was almost spilling out of the slot at the top. So we were standing there. The attendant had the hose in his hand, pumping our gas, and I was plucking $20 bills out of the top of this thing. I wasn't even trying to hide what I was doing, and John was acting all silly, cracking up because I was so calm and blatant about it. At some point, the kid who was pumping the gas noticed. Today, when I think about it, I feel bad for a kid like that. But at the time, I was in a different place. I didn't have those feelings for anybody. Anyway, I just gave this kid a look. You know, I don't fuck with me look. And he decided not to pursue it. At least not directly. Instead, he headed off into the office, where there was a phone. "Come on, Teddy. We've got to blow this place. He's calling the cops." John yanked at the nozzle out of the gas tank and threw it on the ground while it was still pumping. It snaked and squirted gas all over the place. I plucked a couple more bills out of the capsule, and then I got into the car. John had already started it up. The kid saw us and came running out of the office to stop us. I started getting out of the car to confront him, and he ran back inside. Okay, I shut the car door, and we were about to leave again. And again he came running out. It was slapstick stuff. This time, I took the gun, and I aimed it at him. He stopped dead in his tracks, and hit the deck like he was already shot. He was scared out of his mind. I raised the gun, and I shot it into the air. Except he didn't know. He was face down and whimpering. Half an hour following the ordeal, Teddy and John were cruising along Victory Boulevard when John noticed a cop car in the rearview mirror. Immediately panicking, given their antics, he shouted into the tension-filled air, "Oh, we're fucked, man. We're fucked, Teddy. Maybe we should just make a run for it. Just keep driving." "They don't have the light on," Teddy clarified. "Yeah, you're right." They continued to drive a couple of miles, far enough to begin to think that maybe it was just a coincidence, because they weren't doing anything. Then, at the far end of Victory Boulevard, lined up in a brigade on the street about 300 yards ahead of them, was a roadblock of 10 police cars. "Holy shit," John squealed in a high, terrified voice. "Oh, fuck." The cops acted quickly, and they were crouched down, with guns and rifles drawn. "Stop the vehicle," came the command from their PA system. John slammed on the brakes, causing the car to skid to a halt. By now, there were cop cars behind them too. The one that had been following him, along with some others. "Don't move! Put your hands where we can see them," they shouted aggressively. Teddy would later recollect the pandemonium that ensued. It was strange. I felt very calm. My thoughts were clear. I should have been like John, scared and shaky. But I wasn't. I had the gun in my waistband, and I knew what was going to happen. I started to think of where to put the gun, where to hide it. These were seemingly rational thoughts, though given the danger, they were not. At first I thought I'd put the gun in the visor. I started to raise it, but I could hear the rustle of the cops' guns and their uniforms. I could hear their nerves like strings being wound on a guitar. Over the PA, one of them shouted, "Don't fucking move! We will shoot you if you move." I must not have listened at first, because they kept screaming, "Do not move! We will shoot!" John was saying, "Teddy, listen to them for Christ's sake! Listen to them!" Something penetrated, because I stopped moving my hands up. Instead, I bent forward and threw the gun under the seat, and again heard that rustle of movement and nervousness. It's amazing that they didn't shoot. I always tell the fighters I train that motion relieves tension. If you don't move, you go to this place where your muscles control you instead of the other way around. And that's what I was hearing. All this motion, the sound of those cops trying not to go to that place. In the next moment, they rushed the car. Hands reached in and pulled us out, throwing us to the ground. One of them cracked me on the head with his fist. Another one said, "Where is it?" I didn't answer. So they started taking the car apart, yelling, "Where the fuck is the gun?" They took the seats out and put them on the sidewalk. They still couldn't find it. I was just lying there, hoping against hope they wouldn't find it, but knowing they would. They would indeed. After 5 minutes of intense searching in the car, the gun was found. It had been caught on a spring located under the seat, and so was difficult to retrieve. As the seat was lifted out, the gun hung there in all its metallic glory, representing a grim end to Teddy Atlas's latest criminal escapade. Upon his arrest, Teddy would find out that along with the robbery, he was also being charged with attempted murder because of the gunshot he fired into the air at the gas station. At the police station, the cops ferried him into the back room and began firing questions at him. Disappointment invaded their tone. A kid like you from a good family going off to prison, it's a real shame. They confirmed that Teddy's only way out of this situation depended on if he could supply them with some information on a gun ring they were investigating. He had twice in the space of as many days been caught with firearms, so the police believed that Teddy represented a link in that particular chain. And he did, as he explained. I knew the names of some of these wise guys who were involved in the ring just from hanging around the kinds of people I was hanging around with. I said, "Are the guns you're interested in 38s? And when I said that, all the detectives perked up and drew their chairs closer. "What did I tell you?" one of them said to the rest. "No, the reason I'm asking," I said, "is because I don't know anyone selling 38s. It was a stupid show of smart-ass bravado, and they didn't appreciate it. One of them hit me so hard he knocked me off my chair. You think you're funny? You think you're a tough guy?" Later on, they presented Teddy with a piece of paper. It was a signed statement given by John in an attempt to save his own skin. They also had another statement from Billy, received 2 days earlier following the skirmish at the bar. "Your pals put everything on you. They said it was all your idea, that you got the guns and decided what to rob. Nice friends you got." At first naively believing in honour amongst thieves, Teddy refused to look at the statements, simply stealing a glance once the backs of the officers were turned. He spied the signatures of his former comrades confirming betrayal. They informed Teddy that they were releasing John, that he'd made bail. They said, "He's going home, and you're going to Rikers, where you're going to get fucked up the arse by niggers. That doesn't piss you off? You want to just let him get out this way? This guy who was supposed to be your friend?" Teddy knew they were trying to manipulate him, though he also knew they were telling the truth. It made him realise that you can't assume that someone is your friend. That didn't mean he would turn on them as they had to him. However, for Teddy, that wasn't an option. To him, it didn't mean that he was stronger than John or Billy. It was just that if you didn't think there was a choice, then there wasn't any temptation to cave to pressure as those men had. The next morning, John was released from jail and Teddy was sent to Rikers Island, one of the world's largest correctional facilities which houses detainees awaiting trial. The news of his arrest was featured on the front page of the Staten Island paper, and his bail was set at a sum of $40,000. Theodore Atlas was furious and refused to pay Teddy's bail. His mother wasn't happy either, though she understandably didn't want her son languishing in jail. She threatened Theodore with a "your money or your wife" ultimatum, saying, "Either you put up the house as collateral for his bail, or I'm leaving you." The trip to Rikers seemed to take hours in Teddy's eyes. Upon arrival, inmates began the first step of a long processing routine in which they were transferred from one station to another like cattle. Finally, Teddy was told to strip down and endure the indignity of having his arse cheeks spread and searched. Following this ordeal, he was then handed a set of plain blue clothes and was taken to his cell. Teddy would have strong opinions on prison, stating them years later. He said, "It was funny what the mind can do. I mean, once they put me in this 5-by-8-foot cell with a barred window the size of a postage stamp, I realised that if I stretched up and craned my neck, I could see and hear the planes taking off and landing at LaGuardia Airport. It's almost cruel that they put a prison right next to an airport that way. Watching those planes, I began to imagine that I was on one of them. I made a deal with whoever, with God I guess, that if I could be on one of those planes, that I would accept that the plane was going to crash. I would take the chance. At first, I thought I was the only one having thoughts like that. I thought it was a form of weakness, but then I thought, if I'm having these thoughts, other people must be too. I couldn't be the only one. It was a revelation. In the mess hall, in the yard, these guys would try not to let on that they'd been having these thoughts the same way that fighters try to not let on that they're having thoughts that scare them. Of course, everyone has them. When I came to realise that, it helped me put my fears into perspective. It's one of the things that I've used ever since, and that's helped me to become a good trainer. Early on, Teddy made it clear that he would defend himself in whatever way he had to whilst in prison. He exhibited a show of force when one day, a tough-looking inmate, standing at 6 foot tall and with a confrontational scowl, let Teddy know that he liked his trainers and wanted to have them. Teddy reacted swiftly and with considerable violence. I just went after them, he said. I knew that if I didn't, it wouldn't stop there. I knew that after the sneakers, it was going to be my dignity. He would try to take my soul. Some people might feel it would be easier to avoid the confrontation, to give up the sneakers. In the ring, I see fighters quit or give up all the time because it feels at that moment like it's the easiest option. I always tell them the easiest thing is actually to make a stand. The acts of fighting, of facing what you must face, last only a few minutes. Otherwise, you must deal with and live with the consequences forever, and that's much harder. So, I went after this guy, and it really didn't matter who got the best of who, though I think I got him more shots than he did before the guards broke it up. The point was, I was standing up for myself. That was what was important. After that, I was pretty much left alone. Though Teddy spent much of his time at Rikers as something of a lone wolf, he did forge some meaningful relationships. One was with a clergyman, Chaplain Tim MacDonald, also known as the brother of The Rock. He knew Teddy's uncle, and as such, he kept a close eye on Teddy's welfare whilst he served his sentence. I didn't know, Teddy would later write, but he was watching through a one-way mirror when they brought me in, and he came in and saw me the next day. Now I know that the Catholic religion has taken a big hit in the past few years, but this guy was the real deal. What a guy like that is supposed to be. He was big, burly, an Irishman, and when you shook hands with him, he tried to break your hand. That was the way he showed you that he was in charge. I knew right away he was telling me very clearly, this is my place. But he was solid, and there weren't many things in there that were solid, or outside of there either for that matter. He already had all my records. He said, "You belong in here, Teddy. You're a dangerous person." He wasn't saying, "You poor thing." I can see you're a really sensitive person deep down. Not that I wouldn't have wanted to hear a little bullshit. I'm no different from anyone else that way. But I appreciated that I wasn't hearing it, that maybe somewhere down the line I could hear some other stuff from him that connected to something real, and that I would be able to trust that what he was saying had meaning. It was another lesson that I would incorporate into my career as a trainer. Teddy would stay in touch with his existential connection upon his release from Rikers Island after Theodore begrudgingly paid his bail. Like everyone surrounding Teddy, Tim was concerned about his probable relapse into crime without proper direction and purpose in his life. Aside from this, Teddy also had an understandable concern about his immediate future. He was facing a 10-year sentence with 2 felonies to his name. He needed to wise up and fast. With a bleak outlook hanging over him, fate would do what fate does, and a guardian angel would be watching. Enter Teddy's childhood friend, Kevin Rooney. Kevin had won the £147 Golden Gloves in New York in June of 1976. Like Teddy, Kevin came from a dysfunctional family, and like Teddy, had previously had several run-ins with the law. It wasn't uncommon for cops in those days to push wayward kids to become involved in boxing through the Police Athletic League programme, which is where Teddy would first meet Rooney. Teddy recalls those early years. He said, "We were boxing in an old laundry room in a rough project called Park Hill under the tutelage of this guy, Ray Rivera. It was a no-frills setup. We'd pick our rubber mouthpieces out of a glass jar by the door and then put them back in the same jar when we were finished. Very sanitary. But it was a good program in lots of ways. It helped kids. I mean, when you think about the fact that Kevin and I are still involved in boxing, that says a lot. Anyway, Kevin went on to fight in the New York Golden Gloves, and during the tournament, the Hamill brothers, Pete, Brian and Dennis, who knew Kevin's brother, introduced him to Cus D'Amato, a well-known fight manager and trainer. Cus thought Kevin could turn pro eventually, and Jim Jacobs, who was Cus's friend and business partner, offered to pay Kevin's expenses so Kevin could live with Cus in Catskill, New York, and train at his gym. It was an offer that Kevin jumped at. Now, 4 months later, right after I got out of Rikers, Kevin called me up. He knew there was a good chance I'd get into trouble again, hanging around Staten Island, and he was trying to help me out. "Come up here, Teddy. I'll ask Cus, but I'm sure it'll be okay with him. You can live here, train for the gloves, and stay out of trouble while you're waiting for trial." I could see it was a good idea. I knew myself well enough at that point to see that this was right. I brought it up with my father, and my father, to his credit, agreed to foot the bill. $50 a week for my room and board. Teddy would also describe the initial meeting with Cus D'Amato in his autobiography. Sunday morning, October 1975. I'm in a train, pulling into the town of Hudson, New York. Rikers seems 1,000 miles away, though in reality, I only got out a week ago. The train slows and stops with a hiss. I grab my bag and get off. Kevin Rooney is standing by an old, white Dodge station wagon. "Cus is back at the house," Kevin says. So we drive across the bridge through Catskill, New York, a small blue-collar town of 19,000 that has seen more prosperous days. You'll see what I'm talking about, Teddy. Every day, I learn something new from him. Kevin explains that Cus shares the house with Camille Ewald, a Ukrainian woman who has been his companion for many years. We pull up a long driveway outside a sprawling white Victorian mansion. Cus comes out on the porch. He's heavy-set, balding, wearing a red and white flannel shirt. He's got a wide, flat face, piercing blue eyes, and eyebrows that arch up like triangles. "You must be Teddy," he says. "I've been hearing good things about you from Rooney." When Teddy first arrived in Catskill, the only people staying at the house was Cus, his common-law wife Camille, Kevin, and another young fighter named Jay Bright, who, like Rooney, would gain more fame for his association with future heavyweight champ Mike Tyson than for his own in-ring exploits. The routine in Catskill, the discipline, it was perfect for Teddy. He would train and do road work in the morning and spend the afternoon attending to housework, mowing the lawn, cleaning, painting, and feeding the dogs and birds. After those tasks were complete, the fighters would go back to the gym at night and punch the bags and spar. At the gym, Cus would hold court in a grey metal folding chair, watching his fighters and advising them. "Remember, it's always good to throw the punch where you can hit him, but he can't hit you. That's the science," was one of his lines. While he didn't get in the ring with his disciples, Cus would demonstrate what he was talking about, moving his hands to indicate instructions. Teddy caught on quickly. In Cus, he felt he had a missing piece of the jigsaw to his life. Someone to guide him, tell him the things he needed to hear. He said, "He made me feel good about myself, focusing on my strengths, not my failings." Cus said to him, "You're loyal, Teddy. You don't rat on your friends." I like that. Rooney and Atlas would spar regularly, with Teddy impressing Cus with his punching power and natural ability in the ring. "You've got professional potential," he told him. "You punch with the right hand as hard as any fighter I've ever had, and you've got a good chin." Teddy felt that the praise was an exaggeration, though the compliments felt good. Jim Jacobs, Cus's best friend and a renowned fight film historian, a world-class handball player, was assigned by D'Amato to manage Teddy when he turned professional. Jacobs was a wealthy man with a manager's license, something Cus didn't possess, and so the dynamic was agreed. Cus the teacher, Jacobs and his partner, Bill Caton, the money and career logistics men. When he felt the time was right, Cus entered Teddy into the Adirondacks Golden Gloves. He was an early sensation, knocking out his first opponent in the opening round, results that would persist all the way to the title. As success and jubilation reigned in Catskill, Teddy still had a black cloud hanging over him. The sentencing date for the robbery and gun charges was quickly approaching, and Teddy was anxious. Teddy returned to Staten Island, trying to mentally prepare himself for the worst. On the day of the sentencing, he sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer, Dan Leddy. As proceedings drew to a close, there was a commotion in the back of the courtroom. Everyone looked around, and there was Cus D'Amato making his way in. Dan Leddy announced to Judge Radin that there was a final character witness looking to talk about Teddy. The defence calls Mr. Constantine D'Amato, he announced. Cus had charisma, and he knew how to command a room. When Leddy asked him to describe the nature of his relationship with Teddy, Cus turned to the judge, and he said, with a wobble in his voice, "Your Honour, I realise you might not know much about me, but I've spent my whole life developing young men. As a boxing manager, I've trained 2 world champions, heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson and light heavyweight champion Jose Torres. I've also helped a lot of other young boys straighten out their lives and build character. I know things about Teddy that this court doesn't know, things that you won't find on his arrest record. This boy has character. He has loyalty. He'll hurt himself before he'll let down a friend. These qualities are rare, and they shouldn't be lost. He's made mistakes. We've all made mistakes. But I've come to know this boy, and if we lose him, we'll be losing someone who could help a lot of people." At this point, Cus began to cry. Without wiping away the tears, he said, "Please don't take this young boy's future away. He could be someone special. Let's not lose him. Please." Even the court officers were hit by Cus's inspired tone. Despite a plea bargain deal set up by Teddy's lawyer, the judge still had some discretion in the terms. He let Teddy off with probation on the condition that he continued living in Catskill with Cus. 2 months later, with the legal problems behind him, Teddy fought Danny Chapman, a guy he had previously knocked out in the Golden Gloves in a club fight. Teddy breaks down the bout. He says, "I dropped him in the first round, but he was real gutsy and got back up. I started to go after him again, and I felt a sudden grab in my upper back, sharp and very painful. Though I hadn't mentioned it to anyone, my back had been bothering me more and more over the months, to the point where I couldn't go through sustained training without it tightening up or seizing up on me. So now, I was in this fight with this tough guy, and I couldn't bend or dip. I was getting hit with punches that I normally would have slipped. Instead, I was just standing there, going toe-to-toe with him, hitting him, but getting hit because I couldn't move. Somehow, I won a close decision, but it was much tougher than it should have been. Of course, Cus noticed. He saw that I was wincing and grimacing after every punch I threw. "What's the matter?" he asked me afterward. "Nothing. You going to tell me or not? I can see you're in pain." My back tightened up. "Where?" "Up here. Right below my shoulders." "Has this ever happened before?" Cus asked. "Yeah, I guess so. I don't know." Cus wanted to take me in for test. I resisted. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to hear some doctor confirm it. In the end, he took me to see this guy in Manhattan, who Jim Jacobs recommended. The X-ray revealed that I had scoliosis, as well as gaps in the vertebrae and a herniated disc. The doctor believed boxing could make Teddy's condition worse. Whereas Atlas would not hear of any negativity, Cus was adamant that Teddy should hang up the gloves. He said, "You heard what he said, Teddy. It's a tough break, but what are you going to do? I can take the pain. He didn't say I had to stop." "He said you could make it worse," Cus replied. "I won't allow it." The 2 men drove in silence for a few miles. "It's not the end of the world," he said at last. "You can still be involved with boxing." "What does that mean?" replied Teddy. "I think you could be a good trainer. I've seen the way you talk to Rooney and some of the other kids. You're a born teacher." "I'm a fighter, not a teacher," snapped Teddy defiantly. And Cus persisted. He said, "You can become the same type of success through your fighters, Because if you take a boy and teach him to fight from the beginning to end, part of you is in him too. So that when he fights, part of you is in that ring. From that day on, Cuss began working on Teddy every chance he got, telling him what he thought that he'd make a good trainer. He really knew how to lay it on. He told Teddy that teachers were born, not made, that he had been born with the gift, and it would be a shame if he didn't make use of that gift. Cuss was very smart about people. He had good instincts about them. At the same time, he had an ulterior motive. If Atlas became a trainer, it would serve Cuss's own purposes. He was getting older, and he needed somebody to help him. Either way, Teddy didn't want to hear it. Still being young, he wanted to fight. The dream of being a professional fighter was the thing that was pulling him forward and keeping him straight. He said, if I couldn't continue, then the hell with boxing, and to the hell with Catskill. At least that was the way I felt at the time. When Teddy told Cuss that he was going back home following the poorly received news, he said, you can't go. You've got to stay here. I'm responsible for you. That was the deal. Despite the fact that the terms of the parole stipulated that he resides in Catskill under Cuss's supervision, Teddy's parole officer, Steve Sawada, had taken a shine to him and thus didn't protest Teddy's decision to go home. If he couldn't fight, he simply didn't want to be at Catskill. Back home, things were pretty much the same as they'd always been, with Theodore immersed in his career and his mother still drinking heavily. Teddy Sr. had harboured embarrassment for how his son had turned out. It was 1975 and Teddy was 19 years old and a high school dropout. It was disappointing for a visibly affluent man like Theodore. He tried to help his son by securing him a job as a janitor at Marine Hospital in the Stapleton on Staten Island. Teddy would work there for a while, but pretty soon boredom would prevail and Teddy would get back to his hoodlum ways, hanging out with the guys down in the neighbourhood, breaking into houses and getting into fights. Cuss and Teddy kept regular contact. Talking every week by phone, Cuss would continue with his line of intention for Teddy, trying to tempt him into returning as a trainer. He said, I need a favour. What is it? Inquired Atlas. Rooney's fighting in the Ohio State Fair. Somebody has to go with him. I can't go, but it's an important thing for him, and he needs somebody he can trust and count on. I need somebody I can trust and count on. The Ohio State Fair was one of the toughest and most prestigious boxing tournaments in America at the time, equal in prestige to the National Golden Gloves and the National AAU tournaments. Any amateur who wanted to be taken seriously had to compete there. If you wanted to fight in the Olympics, you needed to compete in the Ohio State Fair. Cuss knew Teddy's stance on loyalty. Atlas understood that Cuss probably could have gone himself or sent someone else. But what Cuss's request implied was that Teddy owed him something, and he also owed Kevin Rooney too. And it was true. He did. Cuss was also saying that Rooney would have had a better chance to win if Teddy was present, planting the seeds in Teddy's ego. Rooney's trying to make the Olympic team. You could be the difference, Teddy, said Cuss. The attempts at flattery worked. A couple of days later, Teddy boarded a train to Catskill, and then he and Rooney drove the 500 miles to Ohio, a 12-hour trip. The cheapest accommodation was at the State University, so that's where the men stayed, sharing the top and bottom of a bunk bed in one of the dorm rooms. As Rooney's trainer, Teddy had to arrange Atlas's registration in the tournament, sort his medical approval, and find out when he was fighting, and make sure he got there on time and unscathed. Cuss would exhibit pride in Teddy's organisational skill. See, he beamed. I told you you'd be good at this. The fights took place outdoors on the fairgrounds. There were 3 fights going on at any one time in 3 different rings. They used a whistle in one, a bell in another, and a clang in the other, so the fighters would know when a round was over. There were hundreds of fighters nervously pacing the area's perimeter, all eagerly waiting for their bouts. Across the fairgrounds were the rides and the food stalls and the smell of grilled hamburgers and hot dogs lingering invitingly into the air. Teddy recalled the occasion. He said, the first day, Rooney's fight didn't start until 1 a.m. I found out from my father that it took 5 hours to digest food. Except pork, he said. Don't eat pork, it takes longer for the body to break it down. So, I timed Rooney's meal accordingly. While we were waiting for our fight, I eavesdropped on conversations between the other trainers and fighters. There was a lot you could pick up by just listening. About an hour before Rooney's fight, the clouds opened up and it poured. They didn't have tents over the rings, but they couldn't cancel the bouts because the schedule wouldn't allow it. The ring was slippery. The grounds had turned to mud, and the fighters' shoes were slick with mud by the time they climbed into the ring. I found plastic bags and I taped them on Rooney's feet. Just before he stepped in the ring for his fight, I cut the bags off. He was the only fighter with clean, dry shoes. I told him to take small steps, bend his knees, and not move around too much. He kept his footing, won the fight, and afterward I noticed that everybody else started using plastic bags. Following each fight, I looked at the draw, found out who Rooney had next, then dug up all I could about the guy. In the quarterfinals, we fought a New York boxer I knew very well, Davey Moore, a future world champ. He had a very big rep. I called up Cuss to discuss strategy. Moore liked to shoe shine, a showboat move where you drop your hands and throw a rapid flurry of punches to the midsection. Cuss said, "That's good. You know what his main thing is." I had also noticed that Moore didn't bend his knees when he did it. It left him open, so I'd instructed Rooney to fire right back to his head when he tried to shoe shine. At the very least, it might take it away from him. "Call me when it's over," Cuss said. "I'll be waiting by the phone." I phoned Cuss right after Rooney won the fight. He started gushing. "The young master," he said. "You're the young master." You had to hand it to Cuss. He knew exactly what to say. In the tournament final, Rooney would fight Bernard "Bad" Mayers, a fast, talented stylist from Detroit's Kronk Gym. Cuss quizzed Teddy on strategy. He said, "We got to go to the body, take some of that speed away, some of that eagerness. Also, time him. Timing can beat speed." Rooney would need to display discipline to beat such a skilled adversary. At the end of their conversation, Cuss encouraged Teddy's confidence in his guidance of Rooney. He said, "Well, he's in good hands." The fight started well, and Rooney won the first round, though he sustained a bad cut on the eyelid. Rooney, to his detriment, had thin skin around the eyes. Teddy managed to stop the bleeding, but as with the safety-first approach in amateur boxing, the referee would examine Rooney and immediately halted the fight. Back in the locker room, Teddy cleaned Rooney's cut, took some adhesive tape, and made 4 butterfly bandages and taped him up. Teddy admired his handiwork. The butterflies looked good, professional. He'd learned that from watching his father on those dusky visits. When Teddy took Rooney to the hospital to get him stitched, doctors even complimented Teddy on what he'd done. Back in Catskill, Teddy was saturated with praise by the D'Amato clan. "You did a great job, Teddy. He wouldn't have gone that far without you," Camille said. "See, Cuss was right." "Why, I didn't do anything special." "No, Cuss was right." Teddy knew the psychology behind what Cuss and Camille were trying to do. They were thinking only of what was good for Teddy. Though despite his introduction to training fighters, Teddy still wasn't ready yet to make a commitment to being a trainer. In his mind, he was still a fighter. He would once again return to Staten Island a few days later, again regressing back into criminality. Despite what had happened with Billy Sullivan, the supposed friend who had landed Teddy in trouble with the law previously, the two men would recommence their troublesome association. One night in the summer of 1977, Billy and Teddy was driving around Stapleton in Teddy's Chevrolet, drinking Heineken lagers. Teddy picks up the narrative. He says, "Suddenly, this Cadillac with tinted windows cut us off at a light. Billy hit the brakes, and his beer tipped over, sloshing on his pant leg. Son of a bitch. He gunned the Chevy hard, pulling even with the caddy. Hey, jerk off!" He swerved in front of them and hit the brakes. They screeched and slammed to a halt. The driver of the caddy opened up his door and got out. He was a tall black kid with a cigarette in his mouth. He took the cigarette and flicked it toward us. I was out of the door of the Chevy like a shot. Before I got more than a few steps, the other doors of the caddy swung open and 4 more guys appeared. Big guys. I kept right on going, no hesitation, and dropped one of them with a straight right hand and hit another with the left hook. I was doing pretty good, but then the third guy hit me from the side with a blackjack. It stunned me. Before he could hit me again, I grabbed his hair and got him in a chokehold. Meanwhile, Billy was on the roof of the Chevy, brandishing a broken Heineken bottle to keep them away from him. I threw the guy with the blackjack to the ground, and then saw the driver coming at me. I saw the flash of a knife in his hand. It was this kind of knife called a 007, a flick blade. I remember thinking, that's a 007. I knew that he'd have to come with a downward motion, so I tried to close the distance, get inside before he could extend his arm. But I was too late. He stepped back and spun like a matador, slashing the side of my face. The blade was so sharp, I barely felt it. I put my hand up, and my fingers just went into my cheek. There was this thick, meaty flap of skin that moved, a warm, wet, syrupy goo oozing from the gash. I staggered and fell to the ground. The next thing I knew, Billy was dragging me across the street. We were on Broad Street right by the projects. There was this little bodega across the way. Billy took me in and laid me on the floor. I was losing a lot of blood. It was all over the place, streaming through my fingers and onto the linoleum floor. The old couple who ran the bodega were afraid. You could see it in their eyes. Billy was shouting at them to call an ambulance. The old woman found a towel and held it to my face. Almost instantly, it soaked through with blood. She got more towels, and the same thing happened. The old man was frozen, looking at me, holding the phone. Billy jumped over the counter and grabbed the receiver out of his hand. He called 911. "A cop's been shot," he yelled into the mouthpiece. Less than 5 minutes later, 6 police cars and an ambulance arrived. A helicopter's blades motored up above. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, one of the cops with Teddy gave a grim prognosis. "The kid might bleed to death before we get there," he said. And when I heard that, I was afraid to close my eyes or let go of consciousness. "My father," Teddy muttered. "You got to get my father. He's a famous doctor." They took Teddy to Marine Hospital, the place he worked as a janitor. As they were wheeling him in, he was deliriously repeating, "Let my father do it." Of the time, Teddy remembered. The last thing that I remember thinking about before I lost consciousness was his schedule. It wasn't my father who sewed me up. It was an Asian physician, Dr. Lee. It took 400 stitches, 200 on the outside, 200 on the inside. My father showed up later that night. I opened my eyes, and there he was. "How is it?" I asked. "The cut will heal, but you're going to have a scar for the rest of your life," he said. He looked at his hand. There were notes written on his skin. Appointments, prescriptions, phone numbers, things like that. "I have to go," he said. I wanted to say something to him, or have him say something to me, but neither of us seemed to know how. "Good night, Teddy," he said. Later that night, some of Teddy's friends came to visit him in the hospital. They were eager for revenge, promising that they were going to get the guys who hurt Atlas. Teddy, however, didn't care about that. He was consumed by something else entirely. The gold ring that he always wore around his neck on a chain, it was gone. Teddy explained the importance of the jewellery. He said, "The reason the ring had such importance to me was that it had belonged to my childhood friend, Sean Timpone, who had died the year before. Sean and I had always been close. We had a real comradeship. When we were young kids, he was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy and confined to a wheelchair. I used to go take him out and wheel him around the parks in Staten Island. He loved nature and animals, and he was always reading up on various wildlife, talking about how the animals needed to be protected or they'd become extinct. Out in the woods, in these parks, we'd pretend that we were seeing all these extinct animals from the prehistoric era. He loved to fantasize about things like that. When Teddy had left for Cuss and Catskill, Sean's conditioning was worsening. Sometime during the time Teddy was away, he received a call from Sean's father that Sean was in hospital and gravely ill. Teddy would catch the next train back. He was in Doctor's Hospital, one of the 2 hospitals in New York that Theodore had founded. Even though it was past visiting hours, all the nurses knew Teddy and they permitted entry. Sean was laying in an oxygen tent, barely able to speak. Teddy extended his hand underneath the tent comforting Sean by holding his hand. He began to read a poem that Cuss always recited to all of his fighters. It was called Don't Quit. Teddy explained, and the last couple of lines went, "You can never tell how close you are. It may be near when it seems afar. So stick to the fight, and when you're hardest hit, it's when things go wrong that you must not quit." I didn't even know if Sean could hear it, but I just kept reading the poem to him over and over. I don't know how many times. The next morning, someone touched me. I opened my eyes, and it was Sean's father. "Teddy, the nurses told me you've been here since last night." He was amazed. He told Teddy how much it meant to him that Sean had such a loyal friend. "Now you should go back home," he said. "There's nothing more you can do here." Teddy embarked on the road back to Catskill. When he got there, Sean's father called and thanked him again, saying whatever he'd said to Sean had helped because he'd made a small recovery. Enough so that he could come home. That's what he wanted, Teddy said. 2 days later, Sean died. His parents asked Teddy to be one of the pallbearers. Teddy said, at the funeral, they had an open casket. Sean's mother slid the ring off his finger while I was standing there. His fingers had gotten so thin in his illness that it just came right off, and she gave it to me. That's the reason why, even with 400 stitches in my face, I was concerned about finding that ring. I knew there was only a slim chance that my buddies would find it. I mean, a gold ring lying on the street in that neighbourhood. When they came back a few hours later, they looked grim. Then Bruce Spicer, a member of the gang, smiled, and he opened his palm. The ring! Following the darkness of that night, 2 rays of sunshine would enter Teddy's life, pushing him away from crime and towards his true vocation, training fighters. Joe, the Blade Slattery, and Freddie Coop were 15 or 16 years old. They had approached Teddy on the street one night with a request that Atlas train them. They were both thin, but Joe was especially skinny. He was tall, standing at 6 feet and around 175 pounds, with dark hair, olive skin, and dark eyes. The reason they called him the Blade was due to his illegal artistry with a 007 flick knife, the same model that had carved a map into Atlas's now characterful face. Joe was raised in a trauma-filled family unit. One of his brothers was a methadone addict and had stabbed him. Another brother had hit him with a baseball bat. Certainly an unnurturing environment. Freddie Coop had his own problems, though not nearly as bad as those Joe was afflicted with. Both boys were craving some structure and discipline. The fact that they had sought those virtues from Teddy. Perplexed, but he agreed to teach them. Teddy recalled their early association. He said, "I took them over to a gym in the basement of the church that was run by my old mentor from the PAL, Ray Rivera. He was the same as ever, still having the kids put their mouthpieces in the communal jar by the door. I'd been one of his toughest kids, and he had a soft spot for me. He helped me out, let us use some of his equipment, gloves and wraps, jump ropes and other stuff. This was in springtime. A month later, the church closed the basement for the summer. I didn't consider stopping. I asked Ray if we could borrow some equipment for a few months. He had an extra pair of gloves he could spare, a pair of hand pads, and a few other things to let us have. We trained outdoors in Silver Lake Park near the reservoir every day from 2 to 5 in the afternoon. Ray had been able to spare only 1 pair of boxing gloves, but we were okay so long as we just working on the conditioning, footwork and technique. Once we started sparring though, I needed another pair of gloves. Hanging on my bedroom wall, I had these gold-coloured gloves that my friend Johnny the Heat Verderosa had worn the night he won the New York Golden Gloves. The reason he'd given them to me was that I helped him out when he was preparing for the finals, even though I was sick with a 102-degree fever and had to get out of bed to spar with him. Me doing that had meant so much to Johnny that he tried to give me the golden gloves the Daily News had awarded him. Of course, I wouldn't take them. Instead, he gave me the gloves he had fought with that night, so that's what we were using. People in the park would stop to watch us. We didn't have a ring. We were sparring on the open grass, and they would watch the old people, kids, parkies, junkies, pigeons, couples holding hands. We were oblivious to everything, caught up in what we were doing. Sometimes at the end of the day, when it was particularly hot, we'd jump in the reservoir to cool off. We weren't supposed to. It was illegal. But we did it anyway. Teddy was a stern taskmaster, making rules for Joe and Freddie that extended beyond their workouts. They couldn't stay out too late. They couldn't be around drugs. They couldn't drink. Meanwhile, Teddy, in a contradictory move, was going out at night after their training sessions and robbing people. The change in Teddy's attitude came after another bleak incident that Teddy recounts in his autobiography. He said, it was a place called Mandia's. They had a late crowd there, and people would come in around 1, 2 in the morning. Screwed up, lost souls, the kind of people who would gravitate towards places like that. I guess I was one of them. I'd go there looking for trouble, and often I'd find it. On this night, trouble started over a game of pool. I put my quarter up on the table, and when it came my turn, some arsehole tried to cut in front of me. He was with 2 other guys. One thing led to another, and I cracked the guy with a pool ball. One of his friends hit me with a pool stick. By the time it spilled out onto the sidewalk, I had broken one guy's jaw and another guy's nose. They kind of quit at that point, and I went home. 4 in the morning, at the end of what was a long night. I was in bed, half asleep, and I got a call from Billy Sullivan. Teddy, we've got big problems. Those guys that you beat up found out where you live, and they're saying they're going to burn your house down. Burn my house down? It was my parents' house. They realise they're all going to die if that happens, I said. I'm just telling you what they said. You made it very clear to them that they're going to die, yes? All right, you tell them that they can meet me somewhere and we'll straighten this thing out. Billy said he'd get the word to them. Half an hour later, I drove over to Techie's Bar on Gordon Street. When I got there, they were already there. One of them couldn't fight because his jaw was broken, but the other 2, they were ready to go. When you were fighting 2 guys at once, the key thing was to nail one guy good right away, because then the other guy tended to lose a little courage. So I hit this one guy with a shot before he even knew what was happening, and he went down. His head hit the ground and bounced. The other guy saw that and took off. Everyone took off. My instinct was to get out of there too. I jumped in my car and drove off. About a block away, I started thinking about the fact that everybody just left the one guy there on the street. His friends, everyone, they just left him. I turned around and drove back. I knew I couldn't afford to get in trouble. I was still on parole, but I went back. At first, I tried to revive the guy. When that didn't work, I dragged him down the street and into the back seat of my car. I took him to Marine Hospital. I went into the emergency room and told them at the desk that I had a guy who was unconscious in my car and I needed them to bring a stretcher out. So they wheeled the guy in. I was about to leave when the nurse at the desk said, "Wait, you can't leave. We need some information." "Where did you find him?" "I found him on the street." "What do you mean you found him on the street? Was he drinking? Was there a fight?" I said, "Yeah, there was a fight. I saw guys running." I wasn't even thinking about how I must have looked, that I had bruises and marks on me. "Just do me a favour," I said. "Tell me if he came to." I was a little worried because he was still unconscious when I brought him in. "They're working on him now. He's still unconscious. Sit down and we'll let you know." I was uneasy about it, but I sat down. After about 5 minutes, I realised what was going on. I got up and ran for the door. Too late. The cops were coming in. It's not a good sign when the cops see you and say, "Hello, Teddy." It was the same pair that had arrested me in the bar with Billy Sullivan. They handcuffed me and brought me back inside. Meanwhile, the guy had come to, and he identified me. I knew at that point I was screwed. The guy's orbital bone, the bone right below the eye, was fractured. They had to do surgery, take the eye out, repair the bone, and then put the eye back in the socket. With something like that, it was going to be a minimum of first-degree assault. Put that on top of my previous record, and the outlook was grim. They put me in lockup, and a few days later, I went before a grand jury, which is the step in the justice process where they ask you a lot of questions and then decide whether to indict you. My lawyer prepared me well. "Don't deny anything," he said. "You tell them you didn't want to fight, but you had to. It was self-defence. When they say you've been arrested, you're out on parole, you say, 'Yes, that's the reason I did not want this to happen.' I did exactly what he said, and it worked. Or at least I thought so, until I found out what had really happened, and they didn't indict me. The DA came up to me afterwards and said, "You're a very lucky guy, but you better start making some different choices in your life. Otherwise, you're going to wind up dead or in prison." As it turned out, the real reason I didn't get indicted, and if I had, it would have changed my whole life. I would have been gone for years, and it was not because of anything I said in front of the grand jury. It was because the guy that I beat up changed his story. What I found out was that a couple of wise guys, who were patients of my father, went in and had a talk with the guy. They told him they'd pay his medical bills, but he better change his story. It's not like my father asked these guys to do this. They did it on their own just because of their feelings for him. After the guy changed his story, the grand jury had no choice but to throw the indictment out. What was interesting to me was that while I was locked up, the thing I was most upset about wasn't my own plight. It was that I was letting down Freddie and Joe, that I wasn't around to train them. The day after Teddy was released, Joe came over to his house. It was 10 o'clock at night. "Teddy, could you come outside?" he asked. Teddy followed Joe, eager to hear his request. "Listen, it's those guys, the ones from the bar. Word on the street is that they're looking to kill you." "They don't have the balls," said Teddy. "They're sneaky bastards, Teddy. They won't fight with you, but they're liable to put two in you one night because they're so scared and embarrassed. Let's not wait for them to do something, Ted." Joe reached into his waistband and pulled out a gun. "We'll go take care of them." Teddy was unsure of how to respond. He rarely bore witness to such loyalty. After some pensive contemplation, Teddy said to himself, "I can't let him do this. I can't let Joe risk himself this way." Teddy was his trainer, and he knew he had that responsibility to keep him safe and on the straight path. Teddy marched back inside, immediately calling his trusted mentor, Cuss. He usually wouldn't have reached for help. It made him feel weak. But this wasn't about Teddy's ego. It was about protecting Joe's liberty and potential. Teddy said, "At that moment, I became a real trainer. I called up Cuss and said, 'Do you still want me to come train fighters for you?' Without even hesitating, he said, 'Come up now.' It was late at night, and he said, 'Come up now.' 'I can't come up now,' Teddy replied. 'First, I've got 2 kids I've been training.' 'You've been training kids?' 'Yeah. I'll tell you about it later. The thing is, I can't come unless I can bring them with me.' 'Bring them with you. Come up now.' Teddy said, 'I'll come tomorrow.' And that was it. He packed his stuff, and the 3 of them went up there the next day. Teddy, the trainer, had finally been born. For Teddy, it was a totally different experience being back in the 9-bedroom D'Amato residence. Before, he had been a fighter with limited responsibilities. Now, he oversaw others' respective boxing journeys. In the space of a few short months, the gym over the police station went from being empty most of the time to being packed with budding fighters from dawn till dusk. Word spread of Teddy's prowess as a teacher, and that the gym was a haven for troubled youths. Kids started attending from across America, keen on learning how to box. Before long, Teddy was tutoring 10 fighters, then 15, then 20, then 30. Teddy commented on the exponential growth. He said, "It was something. It really was. I was obsessed, and the energy I brought to what I was doing rubbed off on everyone else." Cuss was smart. He really was a clever old bastard, and he had understood that I was someone who would be able to breathe life into him and his gym. The fact that I was doing it free of charge was icing on the cake. In fact, it was better than that, because I was paying for the privilege. Or to be more accurate, my father was paying. Cuss was collecting the same $50 a week off me that he had been when I was getting trained, not doing the training. Cuss would say, "It's less money than college, Atlas, and you're getting a better education." It was true. More importantly, I was committed to doing something. I was responsible to something larger than myself. Every day, first thing in the morning, I was in the gym. I'd work with the pros until late afternoon, then with the amateurs in the evening. Often after training was finished, I'd sit around with the kids, talking to them about whatever problems they might be having at home, trying to help them figure out how to deal with what were often difficult situations. Teddy would take them on picnics, to the movies, out for pizza. He said, because that was all part of it. Some of the kids came to the gym because they didn't have fathers, or they were escaping from rough home lives. Teddy recognised what it was they needed. He would grow to understand them instinctively because of things in his own life whilst growing up. He was strict with them. He provided structure and discipline, whilst also showing the warmth that came with being a father figure. Teddy was excelling in what looked to be his true calling. He clarified the journey with his group of young gladiators and the inception of their competitive expedition. He said, when you're developing young fighters, after they reach a certain skill level, you need to find suitable opponents for them to fight so they can continue to grow. There were few very good fights for my kids in and around Catskill, so I started taking them down to the city. Cuss knew this guy, Nelson Cuevas, who ran these Saturday night smokers, unsanctioned amateur boxing shows at a club on Westchester Avenue in the South Bronx. Nelson was a former fighter of Cuss's from the Gramercy gym days. He was an interesting guy. He'd been around when Jose Torres won the light heavyweight title with Cuss, but his own fight career hadn't amounted to what he thought it would. Now, he ran the smokers, both to pick up a few extra bucks on weekends and to keep his hand in the fight game. Who could say he wouldn't develop his own champion? Cuss called Nelson one day and paved the way for me to bring my kids to his place. Teddy's doing a good job with them, Cuss told him. I want you to help him out, take care of him. From then on, every Saturday afternoon, I'd drive my kids down to the South Bronx in an 8-year-old blue Chevy station wagon. It took 2.5 or 3 hours, depending on traffic. The club was located in an area so rough that the police didn't bother with it. There was a guy across the street, Mr. Santos, who owned a bar. He and his people would look after my car. We'd come out at the end of the night, and some of the batteries from other cars would be stolen, but my car was never touched. The people in the bar made sure nobody fucked with it. I began writing up accounts of the smokers for the local paper in Catskill, and the editor, a guy named Gunther, who admired what I was doing with the kids, made the mistake of offering me the use of his brand new station wagon if I ever needed it. Well, sometime later, the car I usually used was in the shop, so I took him up on this offer. Saturday came, and the kids and I went over to the paper to pick up his brand new Ford Country Squire. Gunther had grown up in Catskill, and he was a little naive, but even so, as we were getting in his car, the reality of where we were going began to dawn on him, and he got a little nervous, and he said, "So I don't need to worry, do I, Teddy? I mean, where you're going isn't the kind of neighbourhood where they're going to steal my hubcaps, is it?" "No, not at all, Gunther," I said, hitting the gas and waving goodbye. I turned to the kids, knowing he couldn't hear me, and said, "It's the kind of neighbourhood where they take the whole car." The building hosting the Apollo Boxing Club was one of the few on the block that wasn't dilapidated. The air leading to the top floor was permeated with the stench of urine. The floor was littered with used needles. Nearing the third floor, you'd begin to hear the noise, Latin music roaring from a boombox, and a din of a couple of hundred boisterous voices could be heard. It cost $3 a head to get in, and the room was always packed to the brim with visitors. There was a pungent smell of cigar smoke, booze, fried food and sweat. On the near side of the room was the ring. On the far side was a makeshift bar where they sold liquor and Spanish food, fried bananas, empanadas, potatoes in oil, canned beer, and rum in paper cups. Families came to watch their kids and cheer them along as they boxed. Men came to gamble and drink. Though the scene was dank, this was a hub of positivity, a place where young men could come to forge their sensitivities into steel. Teddy describes his initial experience of this fistic coliseum. He said, "I was the only white guy in the place, me and some of my kids, and even though I didn't speak Spanish, Nelson wound up making me the matchmaker after a few weeks. I think he knew I'd be good at it, but it was a difficult task because there was a lot of lying going on. Everybody wanted an edge. They'd say their guy was 10 when he was actually 12. They'd say their guy had no fights when he'd actually had 5 fights. But you learned the code. You learned that no fights meant a kid had a minimum of 3 fights. 1 fight meant 6 to 10. 3 meant anywhere from 10 to 15. and once they said 4 or more, forget it. The kid was practically a pro. So you came to understand to what degree they were lying, and you took all that into consideration. From the kids' point of view, it was even rougher. They'd walk into this big room and look at the other kids and try to figure out who they'd be fighting, and they would grow up in that way, right in front of me. They were on their way to becoming pros, and they didn't even know it. Pros for the real world. Their hearts were going a million miles an hour. They were dying inside. I remember looking at one of my kids one time, and I knew he was dying. I said, "Don't worry, you can't see it." He said, "See what?" I said to him, "See your shirt moving up and down over your pounding heart?" He looked down at his shirt and then at me. I smiled, and when he saw me smile, he smiled back because I was telling him it was okay. There were always mixed emotions for the kids. They wanted the glory, but they were also afraid. Here they were in this madhouse with 200 or so people jammed into the place. On some level, it had the feeling of a meat market. They were just waiting for their call, waiting to be tapped on the shoulder and hear the words, "You've got a bout," because they wanted to be fighters, and they dreamt of being the next Sugar Ray Leonard and having the chance to be on TV. At the same time, they were hoping maybe they'd get the other kind of tap, the one where they would hear, "Sorry, couldn't get you an opponent," and the knot of fear would loosen in the stomach, and they'd be able to mutter regretfully, "Ah, too bad." For 5 years, from 1977 to 1982, Teddy travelled with his boxing brood every Saturday afternoon, leaving Catskill and not arriving home till 4 in the morning on Sunday. Teddy embraced the magnitude of the responsibility to his fighters, knowing that a loss or bad experience in the ring could lead that to a fighter leaving the camp due to being disheartened and defeated by dismay. There were different ways to ensure a good match, Teddy explains. I might know the coach, or I might have seen the kid fight before. That was the best way. But there were so many new kids and coaches showing up there each week, it got tricky. You might have to go by someone else's word, and you didn't know if you could trust them. Even if their intentions were good, the judgment might not be. So you had to know who you was getting information from. Always, in the end, I'd want to take a look at the kid if I hadn't gotten a line on him I was satisfied with. If he was tall, skinny, I wouldn't take him. Most tall, skinny kids have a lot of leverage. They can almost always punch like bastards, so I'd turn them down. Then I'd watch later in the night as they knocked some guy dead and know that I'd been right. When it came down to it, if I still wasn't sure, I'd pull out my trump card. I'd go up to the trainer and I'd say, "Look, I have a feeling that your kid has more fights than you're saying. My kid's green. As soon as that bell rings, I'm going to know if you've been straight with me. If your kid's a ringer, 2 things will happen. 1, my kid will have a problem, but I won't let him get hurt, and I'll stop the fight. 2, if that happens, then you're going to have a problem, because I'll be on my way over to you. So think about it. We've got another half an hour before this match." Or 20 minutes later, Nelson would come over and say, "Teddy, Jose said you don't want to make that match." And I'd say, "Tell Jose, thank you." Teddy Atlas's only real problem that first year at the Apollo was that they weren't getting the decisions they deserved. There were a lot of corruption within the judging. The judges were simply audience members, many of whom had kids boxing on the card, fights which those judges were betting on. As a result, robberies were a commonplace, and Teddy would have to combat the impact on his team's morale with his verbal psychology. And he'd say, "You're getting good experience, you're learning, you're going through the process. Even though they're robbing you, the most important thing is that you're improving. They won't be able to rob you after a while," he would tell them. Teddy would submit fight reports detailing those encounters to the Catskill Daily Mail. He said, "I'd write these colourful stories about the fights, and I thought if a kid really won, I'd put down that he won." The kids loved it. They loved reading about themselves. It made a difference. At a certain point, though, I knew I had to do more than just talk or right the wrongs. Teddy ventured into Nelson's office one day, and he was dressed in a colourful 3-piece suit that betrayed the outline of the gun that he kept tucked in his waistband. Teddy and Nelson were linked by cuss and a mutual love of boxing, though they were adversaries through competition. "Nelson, tonight my guys are winning," declared Teddy. "I'm sure they will," Nelson replied. "They always fight good." No, you don't understand," Teddy said. Tonight they're winning. I know, Teddy. They're winners. They're good kids. No, Nelson, you're not understanding. I'm telling you, they're going to get their fucking hands raised tonight. They need it. They deserve it. And he ain't going to let you rob them tonight. Maybe it sounds to you like I'm trying to fix it, but my kids are going to win anyway, and I just want to make sure you're going to acknowledge it. Sure, Teddy. I see what you're saying, understood Nelson, acknowledging a fix. Good. And there's another thing. Teddy opened the bag to reveal a large trophy measuring at least 3 feet tall with a gold figure on top of it. Wow, that's beautiful, commented Nelson. Starting tonight, Teddy said, there's going to be a trophy like this for the fighter of the night. That's great. That's a good idea, Teddy. But I can't afford a trophy like that every week. I'll pay for them, volunteered Teddy. I'll bring one down every week, and you'll give it to the fighter of the night. Tonight, it's going to be Mane Moore. Mane was a member of the team who suffered with a crisis of confidence and was beset by shyness. Boxing had provided him with the same outlet afforded to many a struggling youth. It was a way to bolster his fragile psyche and battle the omnipotent bullies that plagued many a school day. But the fights haven't even taken place yet, pleaded Nelson. Tonight, Mane Moore is the fighter of the night, insisted Teddy. Nelson was shaking his head. However worn down he might have felt, Nelson didn't show it, and he stayed true to the script. After the last fight, he climbed into the ring and took the microphone with his usual panache. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, the Apollo Boxing Club is proud to bring a new tradition, Fighter of the Night. Teddy recounts his pride for Mane, as well as the reaction of Team Atlas. He said, at that point, someone handed Mane the trophy. I was looking at my kids. I always had them sit in one area quiet and still, like little soldiers. When the trophy came out, you would have thought it was, forget it, a brand new go-kart or mini-bike. They were going to win. They were slapping each other, saying, holy shit, it's bigger than me, and looking around trying to figure out who the winner would be. When Nelson announced, and the fighter of the night is Mane Moore, I was looking right at Mane. He couldn't even take it in. He couldn't process it. All my kids started hitting him, whacking him on the head and the back. Then the Spanish kids came over. At first, they'd been mad, they didn't get it, but within seconds they understood that something special was taking place. They joined in, whistling and cheering. Mane had fought a hell of a fight that night, so it wasn't like charity, it was real. All these kids were patting him on the back, congratulating him, and he just looked confused. One of them said, Mane, it's you. He said, what? He looked up and saw Nelson in the ring holding the trophy, waiting for him. He couldn't understand it. He looked at me and I nodded. When he got up and stepped into the ring to accept the trophy, the whole place erupted. They gave him a standing ovation. Mane finally came out of his daze and grinned that toothy smile of his. It was worth 1,000,000 trophies to see that smile. It really was. Now, as Teddy was shaping precocious lives in the gym, perhaps the most precocious to ever enter his life was soon to fatefully cross his path. Sometime in the fall of 1979, Costi Amato would receive a call from Bobby Stewart, a counsellor at the Tyrone Reform School in Johnstown, New York. He had a 12-year-old kid under his supervision that he wanted Cus to have a look at. The kid's name was Mike Tyson. Stewart, a former US Golden Gloves light heavyweight champ and a one-time pro who fought on the US undercard of Rumble in the Jungle against debutant Kenny Jones, oversaw Elmwood Cottage, a disciplinary dormitory where the worst kids at Tryon often found themselves after various transgressions of the rules. Tyson, who had recently arrived from the Spofford Juvenile Detention Centre in the Bronx, was transferred to Elmwood after flying into a rage and beating up a kid whilst he was housed in one of the lower security cottages. The violent outburst wasn't surprising to anyone who knew Tyson's background. Mike had been raised in the worst section of Brooklyn and had accumulated by the age of 11 a criminal record longer than Santa's wish list. What set Tyson apart from other violent young kids of his age was his unusual physical size. Even at his tender age, he stood at 5 feet 9 inches and possessed a muscular 190-pound physique, freakish dimensions for his age. According to Teddy, he said, it's unlikely but not entirely out of the question that the incident that got Tyson moved to Elmwood was calculated. He had been intent on meeting Bobby Stewart from the moment he learned Stewart was a former pro fighter. The assault, premeditated or not, helped him achieve that goal. Tyson, like a lot of kids from rough backgrounds, saw boxing as a way out. When the then champ Muhammad Ali visited Spofford the previous year, the impact on Tyson had been huge. Seeing the greatest in the flesh was exciting enough for an underprivileged kid, but even more mind-bending was to see the way the other kids and the guards reacted to him, the way they hung on to his every word and smiled and tried to touch him. If that's what being the champ of the world got you, then Tyson wanted to be champ of the world. In Bobby Stewart, he saw someone who might be able to help him, if not to become a champion boxer, at least to help him improve his immediate situation and maybe gain him some special privileges. When Stewart began teaching Tyson, several things became immediately apparent. First, and most obvious, was that Tyson was tremendously large and powerful for his age. Second, he was a prodigiously gifted athlete with exceptional hand speed. Third, and perhaps the most impressive, he had the retentional ability of a sponge, soaking up every droplet of sweet knowledge that Stewart could impart. After a few months, Stewart decided he needed a second opinion, fresh eyes to confirm that Mike was all that Bobby thought he was. He took Tyson over to Matt Baranski's Trinity Club in Albany. Baranski had trained Stewart in his amateur career and would later become Tyson's cutman upon him turning pro. Baranski corroborated his former pupil's assessment. The two discussed what to do next. Neither Baranski nor Stewart felt that they had the time or the resources to unlock Tyson's full potential. They both knew Cuss and Jimmy Jacobs, and they knew about the program Teddy Atlas headed up for the kids, some of whom resided with Teddy, Cuss and his family. It could be a good fit for Tyson, they agreed. So Bobby Stewart made the call. He said, "This kid's pretty good, but I think I've taken him as far as I can." Cuss D'Amato agreed to let them come down. He consulted Atlas upon his arrival. "I want your input, Teddy," he said. "You're the one who'll be working with him. Maybe Stewart is right, and he's a special kid." The day Stewart arrived at Catskill with Mike Tyson, Cuss showed up at the gym with his friend, Don Shangana. Teddy was occupied with training 4 of Shaniga's sons, and he joked grimly that Atlas was the reason that the boys weren't dead. He contended that he would have killed them if boxing and training with Teddy hadn't calmed them down in their feral ways. Shaniga was a hard-drinking Irish bookmaker who enjoyed Cuss's company and sat in awe of Cuss as he told one of his myriad of boxing stories. Also, Shaniga was something of a trickster who had political connections in town, which made him an asset to Cuss. Teddy was impressed by young Mike's stature. He said, "It was the 3 of us there in the gym when Stewart showed up in the prison van. He had Tyson with him, and the kid was as impressive a physical specimen as advertised. 190 pounds of pure muscle. It was hard to believe that he was an adolescent. In fact, when Stewart was gloving him up, Shaniga said, 'I gotta see this kid's birth certificate. The only way he's 12 years old is if he laid in his mother's blubber for 12 years before they discovered him.' That was the way Shaniga talked." Stewart actually had documentation. The kid was 12. You have to imagine it. I was up in the ring with him, Stewart and Tyson. Cuss and Shaniga were sitting in these folding seats outside the ring. Cuss wore his glasses. Stewart, as I said, was a former pro fighter with about 14 fights. He was 28, a light heavyweight. He was a man, and he was in there with a 12-year-old kid. True, the kid outweighed him by a few pounds, but he was a kid. He couldn't even get into an R-rated movie by himself. It was one thing to look imposing. There were plenty of guys out there with impressive physiques who could shake the bag if you let them. It was something else entirely to put the gloves on and try to deal with another fighter. Normally, with a green kid like this, we wouldn't put him in the ring. But this was an unusual situation. It was a one-day audition, and we needed to find out about Tyson. We needed to see his character and find out some things about him that we weren't going to find out by watching him hit a bag. It was understood that if we decided we wanted to get involved, there would be no more boxing until we taught him what we needed to teach him. But for this day, what made sense was to see him box. When the bell rang, Tyson rushed at Stewart extremely aggressively, firing shots at Stewart's ribs and stomach. Stewart winced. Tyson was extremely raw with crude technique, but there was a quickness and tenacity in his attack that was unusual in an untrained boxer. Stewart had to keep hitting him just to alleviate Mike's offence. In the second round, Tyson received a bloody nose. By then, Teddy had seen enough. Stewart was working hellaciously to keep his young foe at bay, to prevent him being overrun by Tyson's power. We were professionals, Teddy said. We knew what we were looking at. At the end of the second round, I looked over at Cuss. He was smiling. I shouted, "Okay, that's it. That's enough." Cuss already knew I was going to be the kid's trainer, so he just sat there watching and not saying anything, wanting to see how I handled things. Tyson objected in that lispy voice of his, which was an octave higher then. No, I'm going another round. I want another round." He was trying to show how tough he was because he wanted to be accepted by us. He wanted to ace his audition. His life audition. I already knew what was going to happen. I knew that I'd be working with him, and it was important to establish the way things would be. I said, "That's it. Get out of the ring. 2 rounds is all you're going today." He didn't really want to go another round. He wanted me to think that he wanted to go, but he didn't really want to. He kept making a fuss, looking over at Stewart and saying, "We always go 3 rounds." I got up in his face. "That's it. You're done. Now get out of the ring." I wiped off his nose with a towel, and he stopped. Teddy was showing him that he knew he was coming back to Catskill, and that Atlas knew he was going to oversee his training and mentorship. Teddy said, "Cuss always said that I was born to be a teacher, and part of it, I guess, was that I could recognise what was going on with a kid like this, and know what I needed to do." Of course, Cuss was also flattering me, throwing me pieces of candy like that. He was good at it. He knew when I needed stroking. I remember one day, a year or 2 after this first encounter we had with Tyson, Cuss and I were sitting in a lunch counter in Catskill, eating cheeseburgers. The guy behind the counter, the owner, said to me, "I saw you on ESPN the other night." I was training Rooney at the time, and the fight had been on TV. Cuss jumped right in and said to the guy, "This is the young master. This is Teddy Atlas, the young master." When we went to pay, the guy waved his hand and said, "No charge." He was a boxing fan, and he wanted to buy us our cheeseburgers. Cuss could have been gracious about it and just said thanks, but instead he said, "One of these days we'll come back here and buy this place out from under you. This is young master, and he's going to be rich and famous and have nothing but world champions." Meanwhile, I could barely afford a freaking cheeseburger. It was lucky the guy was treating. All the same, I walked out of that diner feeling like I already owned it and was a successful trainer of world champions. That's how intoxicating it is to hear that stuff. So now, here we were, standing outside the ring with Tyson and Stewart and Don Shanager, and Cuss turned to me and said, "What do you think?" "Strong kid, he can learn." "This young man can be the heavyweight champion of the world," Cuss replied. "He might be your first heavyweight champ, Atlas." So that brings an end to part 1 of the Teddy Atlas story, and what a hell of an opening part this has been. Very educational, I must say. Really enjoyed going through all of Teddy's early misgivings, the incidents, the level of criminality he was involved in, the incident that left him with a scar upon his face, and it's really educational to learn all of this stuff. So I hope that you guys that haven't really learnt about Teddy Atlas have learned a great deal about him already in this first part of his career profile. It's been really enjoyable for myself. I've really enjoyed learning the stories, reading them out to you guys, giving you Teddy's perspective on a lot of the things, and it's been really good to be able to get this first part out of the way and end it at a really good point, because this is now where Mike Tyson comes into the equation. We've met him now for the first time under Teddy Atlas, and now we get to see what happens next. For those that are boxing fans and avid historians, of course you know what's coming next. You know the story, you'll have followed the story, you'll have done it through Tyson's perspective. But this is Teddy Atlas's career profile, so this is all about his perspective on how everything went down and his career moving forward. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this first part. If you have, then of course, please do let us know. On Spotify, you can comment below and let us know what you thought of the episode. By doing that, you're allowing others to see what the episode is all about and how enjoyable the episode is. Of course, I will also publish any comments where, if it is a bit half and half or a bit hit and miss in your opinion, I'm going to publish them too, guys. I want the feedback to come in. So if you're on Spotify, again, please do leave a comment below. If you're listening to this on YouTube, again, leave a comment in the box below. It is really appreciated. And if you've really enjoyed this first part and are looking forward to the next part, make sure you leave us a review on Apple. You leave us a star review, you leave us a rating. It's really, really appreciated. So please make sure you do that for us. A big shout out goes out to Jamie Albrecht, of course, the co-host of the BTR Boxing Podcast Network, for his support in putting this episode together. This is, of course, part 1. Part 2 will be being released next. So please do make sure you tune in for that as we guide ourselves through Teddy Atlas's career as a trainer and how he gets on with Tyson, all the stories, all the notable moments. Of course, they will be being delivered in the next episode. Also, a big shout out goes out to the patrons of the podcast. You guys have got this episode earlier than everybody else, so thank you for supporting us through patreon.com, and we're glad to be able to do this in return for you guys by giving you early before anybody else gets it. It is also completely ad-free, so if you are a patron and you are benefiting from that, please do let us know on Patreon, on the page, on the post that I do put out on there. It is really appreciated to get all of your guys' feedback as well. But it's also a good opportunity to tell everybody about Patreon and what it does. It's a membership service which allows you to subscribe to us for a small nominal fee, and in return you will get access to episodes like this earlier. They will be completely ad-free. All of the shows are ad-free on the network, and you will get patron-only content as well. And since Jamie's joined the network, we are developing new ways of delivering content to yourself. So please do keep an eye out if you're already a patron. And if you're not a patron, it's a good time to go and check us out. And if you can support us, please do. It really, really is appreciated. It allows us to continue to source the material, get the artwork, get the videos produced for all the promotion for these episodes. And without that, it would be a lot more of a difficult task to do. So thank you for supporting us in that way. For those that are not able to support us, I also want to say thank you for supporting us in general and retweeting and sharing and liking and sharing and doing all the necessaries on social media. If you're not in a position to support us on Patreon, the best thing you can do is share it on social media. Let people know on social media about the show, about the episodes, any particular episodes that you've really enjoyed. It really is helpful to us if you continue to do that. I want to give a big shout out to people like Stumpy Lumpy, to people like Dre, to people like Oscar Menendez, to people like Martin Mulligan. All of these individuals are leaving comments on a regular basis, really supporting us. So make sure if there's a facility to leave a comment about the episode, you go ahead and do that. If you've not followed us on social media, you can follow us on X at career_profiles, and everywhere else, it's just the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Make sure you look at us on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok. We are on YouTube. If you wish to subscribe to us on there, we do put our series-based content up there. But if you're interested in other social media platforms, the aforementioned ones are the ones to go through, where you will see all the regular content that gets posted out up on there. But that is it for this first part of Teddy Atlas's career profile. I genuinely hope you've had a great time listening to this and educating yourselves on the stories. And if you've got any thoughts, again, I must implore you to go and let us know across social media or on the comments box below on Spotify or on YouTube. That is it for this episode. You've been listening to the life and the career of Teddy Atlas, Part 1.